Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, Simon. It's been a long time. I'll get to Brighton eventually. Unfortunately, my schedule wouldn't allow me to come over today. It's I don't know how many hours it is on the train from Exeter, but it would be quite a long time. I've still got quite a lot of teaching this term. So sorry you've got me remotely, but we're used to this now, aren't we? I don't know if this is ever going to end. Let's assume it is going to end, and we will soon be having seminars back in person as normal, but we're pretty used to Zoom. Saying that, I'm mostly going to screw up in the next bit where I try and share my screen. That's usually what happens. Before I do that though, maybe just follow on a little bit of Alice's introduction. Hopefully in about half an hour, you're all going to be thoroughly depressed. And like, oh no, what's the point? But don't worry, because then I will lead you into a place of safety and we will march out of our virtual conference this afternoon filled of hope and empowerment. But in order for us to get there, we need to understand where we are right now, which is probably not a very good place. So I'm just going to share my screen and cool, right. All right, so out of control, how humanity created a civilization hell-bent on destroying itself. This is actually the title of a book that in an alternate universe I wrote a year ago. Or rather, it's the title of the book that I told my publisher I would write a year ago, and they've been very good about this. I promise I will write it by the end of this year. I've been really busy, but so this is kind of part book talk for a book that doesn't actually exist apart from in my head. But I have written some of the stuff that I'm talking about, and fortunately other people have written an awful lot. So it's not just complete fabrication. I need to mention COP26 before we carry on. So as you all know, COP26, the last 2 weeks, people have been up in Glasgow doing their best to avert dangerous climate change, which we internationally recognise as 1.5 degrees Celsius. There's loads of different takes about it. It was a success, it was a qualified success, it was a partial success. I think it was unambiguously a failure if you are a member of a country that would be considered to be vulnerable to climate change. So for example, if you're living in a low-lying nation, if you're living in a coastal region in Bangladesh, there doesn't seem to be any indication that we are really even slowing down our climate change impacts. So one of the things I want to do this afternoon is try to get underneath some of the messaging around the climate and ecological crisis and try and unpack really, why do we find it so very hard to stop doing something which is so obviously damaging and dangerous? Everybody's agreed and understood that climate change has got the potential to really unleash havoc on our societies, and it's already unleashing havoc on some people, typically the global developing South. So this is where we are kind of right now. So this is a figure of net carbon dioxide emissions. It goes back to 1980 over here on this axis, and it's measured in gigatons or billions of tons. And this black line here, this is the historical emissions. This red circle is actually from, I think, 2017 or 18. So it needs to be updated a bit. If you don't already know that 2019 is going to see the second largest increase in CO2 emissions ever recorded by humans, because we've just rebounded from the pandemic, right? So it's probably around about here now, and next year will be at or surpassing 2019 levels. Now, these different colored lines that you see, these are things called SSPs. They're called shared socio-economic pathways. They used to be called representative concentration pathways, but basically they're kind of the outputs of these integrated assessment models, these very complicated economic climate models that say, look, if we continue with one route of economic development, basically burn all the fossil fuels and burn lots of coal, by the end of the century, we're going to end up emitting over 100 billion tons of carbon dioxide a year. We'd have pumped out CO2 so much that we could be on course for over 5 degrees Celsius of warming. And that clearly would be a kind of a civilization ending event, right? Fortunately, it looks like we're not following that path thus far. We might actually be phasing out of coal. So then the question is, where in this very, very large space are we going? Where we're meant to be going, the Paris Agreement 2015 was down here, well below 2 degrees Celsius, 1.5. At the moment, when you take various pledges or promises, so these are things that governments say they're going to do, which hopefully would set the regulatory landscape and then the finance landscape, we seem to be heading somewhere around 2 to 3, maybe 3 degrees Celsius. Remember, there is very, very large uncertainties. There's big uncertainties of the climate sensitivity, but really the biggest uncertainty is about how much carbon we're going to produce. So on the moment, we seem to be on course for something around about 2.5 or even 3, pending those promises. Those promises might not materialize, in which case we're going to end up with more warming. Those promises may materialize and we may accelerate our ambition. We might actually do more than we have over the last 30 years. And so we might be able to bend the curve down. But I think the message at this point is that 1.5, limiting it to 1.5 is not physically impossible, but I see actually no probability that's going to happen. Right. So despite the increasing understanding of the science of climate change and I mean, not just climate, but impacts on biodiversity, on impacts on us, we seem to be carrying on essentially, right? Why is that? Well, the question that I've become really interested in, or rather obsessed about actually, is to what extent are we in control of our civilizations? This is a very sort of strange way of looking at it. And one way I came to it was through reading Eric Schlusser's book, Command and Control, which is brilliant. If you haven't read it, you should definitely read it. It's all about the management and mishaps, actually, of the US nuclear strategic and tactical weapon systems. He goes through and tells a number of stories where basically they nearly set off nuclear bombs accidentally, like fires and missile silos. But really the wider narrative, the wider discussion around the book is how can humanity build a system specifically for annihilating itself? And in some respects, I think I see our civilization writ large about that. Also, I think there's a certain amount of therapy in this kind of approach. If you haven't seen this film, then you must do, but I'm sure you have. Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. This, it's a wonderful film, and it's kind of Kubrick's meditation on the possibility of humanity blowing itself up. So this is around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cold War was very hot. There were real possibilities there was going to be a full nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the USA. And Kubrick produced this film. It's a very, very dark satire. It's a very, very funny film, but it's very, very insightful. As one way to try and process how are we meant to understand this? How can we be doing something so unbelievably irrational in many respects? Now, many people know the film because of these wonderful performances from Peter Sellers, who actually plays 3 different characters. He plays President Merkin Muffley on the left, the eponymous Dr. Strangelove in the center, and then Group Captain Lionel Mandrake, who's an RAF officer. 3 completely different characters, all played by Sellers. Does it absolutely magnificently. So it's a beautiful film for that. So if you haven't seen it, you really should do. Right? I think you can probably watch it for free on YouTube now. Anyway, the point of the film is to try to meditate or understand what humanity has done with regards to nuclear weapons. Now, the thing about strategic nuclear weapons then and now is that there's a specific doctrine. The doctrine is always never. These weapon systems must always be available in order to provide a credible deterrent against a first use by an opposing nation. But of course, they must never be used, because if you were to use them, if there was to be a unilateral first strike, then you could be sure that there would be a responding strike. And the consequence of that would be essentially the annihilation of the human race, right? That's the amount of destructive potential that you got with these nuclear weapons. Now, this wasn't a bug, this was a feature, and it was the feature of mutual assured destruction, MAD, which was a lovely way of putting it. The notion that the motivation to build civilization-ending weapon systems was to ensure that they could never actually be used. So this is what the film actually takes. It takes as its starting premise. What happens when you have a system like that, which is controlled or managed ultimately by human beings which may not always be rational? So I've already mentioned Peter Sellers, but you've got to talk about Sterling Hayden, who plays General Jack Ripper. Right now, I'm not going to talk about the film for the rest of this 50 minutes or something, but Jack Ripper is a colonel, I think a colonel in the US Air Force, and he unfortunately has become insane. He's come to the conclusion that the Russians are poisoning the water supply in the United States, such that it is sapping American men of their vital fluids. I mean, and that they're actually, I think they may actually be a form of aliens or something. Basically, he's a wild-eyed, complete conspiracy theorist nut. Many people have lots of interesting and weird and strange ideas. Unfortunately, for humanity, General Jack Ripper commands a wing of B-52 strategic bombers. And what he manages to do, he manages to convince this entire bombing wing that the United States has been subject to a nuclear attack. And so he launches the aircraft, he gives them the launch codes, and they go off and start to do their bombing runs towards the Soviet Union. I don't want to give too many spoilers here, but basically they manage a heroic effort, including the Mandrake character. They managed to call all the bombers back apart from one. There's one bomber that managed to evade all the air defense systems. Its radio system has been destroyed, so it doesn't know it's had the recall. But because of the anti-aircraft impacts and damage that it's had, it can't release the bombs. And there's this wonderful moment where the captain, Major TJ King Kong, goes down into the bomb bay doors and manually releases the bomb, which then produces an iconic scene in cinema, which is him sitting on the bomb and releasing it manually, and then riding the nuclear bomb all the way down onto its intended target, which then sets off, unfortunately, the nuclear apocalypse. Right. So the question I've got is, where is the kind of the agency? Where was the control in that system? Right. So the first question is, where is human agency in strategic nuclear weapon systems? Now, in some respects, there's a very easy to understand sense of agency. In the US system, and also in the Soviet Union, there's equivalent to it. It's represented with the nuclear football. So if ever you see the United States president, he goes in and out of something like Marine One, which is his kind of private helicopter, or onto Air Force One, there will always be a member of staff, typically it's from the US Air Force, but I think other sections of the service can serve the same function, who are carrying the nuclear football. And it's this thing down here, it's this kind of large briefcase, and in there's basically the electronic device that can transmit the US launch codes, right? So basically, if the bomb goes up, if something happens, then the US president is always, I think he's got to be within about 13 meters or something of it. So you can basically flip open, and within a matter of minutes, you can send the launch codes to the strategic nuclear weapon systems of the US, which can then go and obliterate their intended targets. But of course, with mutual assured destruction, there was for a while a process of arms race. There was, I can't remember the US Air Force general who was at a commission. I mean, this is back in the 1960s, when it was being asked, look, do we really need to be spending so much money on strategic weapons, given that we've got the capability, the United States has got the capability to turn, the entire Soviet Union into nothing but embers? And I think the infamous reply was, yes, but I want to see those embers dance. The notion was these must be absolutely overwhelming weapon systems that would completely annihilate the opponent. The problem, though, of course, when you have nuclear weapons of this magnitude, is that they begin to producing so much fallout that they would actually poison the rest of not just the northern hemisphere, but the southern hemisphere. So, for example, this is the Tsar bomb. This was the most powerful nuclear bomb ever created by humans. I think, and they actually detonated this thing. They actually put it in an aircraft and dropped it and then let it off just to see what happens, kind of shit and giggles kind of thing. And it made a great big bang. But they concluded they could never actually ever use it. It had the potential, had the capability of delivering something like 100 megatons of destructive potential, but they could never use it because even at 50 megaton configuration, it was going to produce so much radiation that would have, even if you would have destroyed Washington, you would have poisoned Moscow, for example. So you've got these kind of weapon systems, the magnitude of which you just couldn't use them in any respect. And just to allude back to Dr. Strangelove, part of the plot is about the Soviet Union develops a nuclear system which would assuredly cause mutual destruction because it basically blows the world up. Now, the control in that system is basically a human being at some point has got to press a button. But humans have, over many, many years and now generations, built a system which could quite happily annihilate us. But there's still this notion of control. There's still a human being that has to press the button, a human being that at some point has to decide. And so you can see, at least there is this narrative of control in this civilization ending kind of system. I want to talk about a different bomb, and that's the population bomb. So in the 1950s and 60s, as well as the concern about nuclear Armageddon, there was increasing concerns about population. Because if you don't know, the global population was certainly increasing at an exponential rate in the 1950s, 60s, and then 1970s. Since then, the rate of increase in the global population has decreased. So the greatest increase in the number of human beings on planet Earth was in the early 1970s. And since then, that decrease has been going down, so that we're going to stabilize probably at a population of somewhere around 11 billion people by the end of this century, but with quite large error bars. Now, the reason I want to talk about the population bomb explicitly, because some of the things I'm going to talk about, or when I give talks like this, I'll often have a question in the Q&A, which is about, well, it's all about population, isn't it? Obviously, there's more people. The reason we're in such a crisis with regards to the climate is because there's all these people, because of the population bomb. Well, certainly you're not going to have any people produce impacts if you haven't got any people, but really the kind of bomb that we've got, it's a consumption bomb. Yes, there's more people, but the per capita consumption has exploded. And it's this explosion in consumption, this explosion in the increased consumption of materials, the increased energy consumption of collective humanity, which is largely why we are facing the problems that we are. Now, another thing I need to just reset perhaps some expectations on is that the contemporary way of addressing this is something called the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are 17. These are an evolution of the Millennium Development Goals. And the idea of the SDGs is that these are the kind of things that all the nations have agreed that all of humanity needs to be able to experience or have satisfied. So, for example, no poverty, no hunger, gender equality, access to clean water, clean air, action on the climate. These are kind of things that no one would really dispute, right? But the framing here is that all these needs will be met through development, but sustainable development, right? I just want to point out that there's a very particular kind of argument that's being progressed here. I think I can show that best through the distribution of US family wealth. So this is a kind of various kind of the percentiles, I suppose, but you know, the percentage of the population that has a significant amount of wealth. I mean, here it goes up to 10.4 million. You can see this is essentially, you know, the 1% or the nth of 1%. But regards to the US population as such, you know, the majority of the population is obviously has an awful lot less wealth. So wealth is relatively concentrated into a very small fraction of that particular society. I could have used other countries which have even more concentrated wealth, or I could use a distribution of global family wealth, and they have the similar kind of distributions. The point I want to make here is that we have an agenda for a sustainable development goal, not a sustainable redistribution goal. Certainly, if you're interested in ensuring that everyone has access to clean water, good education, there's more than enough resources at the moment. There's more than enough material resources, there's more than enough energetic resources, there's more than enough infrastructure such that all of those needs could be met. But we don't talk about redistribution. We talk about essentially development such that rising tides will lift all boats. This is the narrative that we've got. With further development, with further economic growth, with further prosperity, we will satisfy all of humanity's needs. At the same time, we may be satisfying a tiny fractions of humanity's wants at larger and larger extents. But the motivation, at least the story they're telling ourselves, is that economic progress and development is satisfying this long tail of humanity down here. So there's something about almost like an origins myth or a creation story about our current civilization. And it goes a bit like this. If you go back about 200 years to the north of England, you'll see increased manufacturing in factories. You would see increased number of machines being used to power those factory systems, steam engines. And those steam engines were also being used to transport goods and services across the UK. So it's the Industrial Revolution. And the story that we tell ourselves is the Industrial Revolution rapidly spread across the UK, then Europe, and the rest of the world, such that today we now live in a highly connected, globalized, industrialized civilization in which we just take for granted many of the things that we buy here were not produced in this country. Much of the food we eat here was not grown in this country. And correspondingly, or consequently, many of the things that happen in one part of the world can have an almost instantaneous and long-lasting effect on pretty much the rest of the world. For example, the 2007-8 and 2008 global food price spike, which produced civil unrest and political violence across the world, may have been the precursor, for example, the Arab Spring. Now, there's another way of looking at that sort of origin story of capitalism or progress and development, and that's to meditate or focus in on the goods and services, on the things that it's given us. Now, here's a nice way to do that. So this is a video from Gapminder, the Hans Rosling founded Gapminder organization, and it's going to show the transformation that the Industrial Revolution and globalized capitalism has produced on humanity as measured by income on this horizontal axis here and life expectancy. So income as little as $500 a day up to and beyond $64,000 down here, and life expectancy as low as mid-20s and up to about 80. We're going to start this video at the beginning of the 19th century. And these different color circles correspond to different countries. They're color coded in accordance to this map. And the bigger the circle, the larger the population. So this big red circle here is China. So if we start the video, you're going to see a number of things. You'll see populations increase, average life expectancy increase, and then average life expectancy decrease, in particular with things like flu pandemics. You're going to see the consequences of economic shocks with regards to changing amounts of average income. But already you can see that we are beginning to migrate out of that bottom left-hand side. There's the First World War. Here comes the Great Depression. Now we're going to see life expectancy fall for the Second World War. Keep your eye on China here. That was the Great Leap Forward and the collapse in agriculture. And these are kind of seismic events. These are literally the events that shaped the late 19th and 20th century. But there seems to be a kind of sorry, I'm just going to get rid of the notification. There seems to be some kind of force driving those countries up from the bottom left-hand side up to the top right-hand side, when certainly if you think about European nations and many others, we're now occupying this top right-hand corner where average incomes are over $30,000 a year and life expectancy can be over 80. I just want to draw your attention to these kind of tail of blue countries. These are African nations, and in particular some sub-Saharan African nations, in which in terms of income, really income isn't any greater than it was in the United Kingdom at the start of the 19th century. So for these nations that haven't really undertaken anything like the same amount of industrialization and development, but the story is that they will eventually, and they will catch up, and that the global poor will become the global middle class, and that humanity will continue to increase its energy material consumption in order to improve the lot of humanity. So we have better lives, high quality lives, longer lives. Now, there's other ways we could look at that transformation of humanity, and I just want to use a couple of figures. We could look at the amount of materials that humanity consumes. Because we've built our cities, we've built our infrastructures, our sewage systems, our road networks, our telecommunications networks. And so in the first instance, we can kind of think about what our civilization has done since and during the Industrial Revolution. And the take-home message there is it's essentially built a fabric over the planet which weighs something in the order of about 30 trillion metric tons. This is the kind of the built environment, the skyscrapers, the fountains, the fondue sets, pretty much everything that we have built. And remember, everything that we have built once was in the ground. We dug up trillions of tons of materials, of metal ores, we've refined them, we've processed them, we've manufactured them, we've transported them, we've crafted them. So this gives a kind of a sense for one material aspect of our civilization. But of course, the other one, the one that we think about much more frequently, certainly the last couple of weeks, is not just the amount of materials that we consume, but the amount of energy. So at the same time as this been tremendous increase in the numbers of people, there's also been an even more tremendous increase in the amount of materials that we consume. And here we've got global primary energy consumption by source. So here we've got from the start of the 19th century, and most of the energy that humanity consumed at that point was what we call traditional biomass. This could be firewood or it could be peat. It's the middle of the 19th century where we see the significant increase in coal consumption, both coal production and consumption, that was led by the United Kingdom because the UK led the world into the Industrial Revolution. And then the 20th century was the century of oil, and then more recently gas. In this visualization, you can barely actually see the renewables. They're kind of stacked at the top here. And if you think about the contribution of low carbon sources, that's wind, wave, solar, nuclear, at the moment, it's about 80%. So all of humanity's energy consumption, about 80% of that is satisfied by gas, oil, and coal. And if you go back 10 years, the fraction of energy, global energy supplied by gas, oil, and coal would have been 80%. So even though there's been exponential increases in things like solar PV and wind, there's been an equal exponential increase in the total amount of energy that humanity consumes, such as the fraction isn't really increasing very much, right? So this is part of the Great Acceleration. This is the period in the development of our civilization, the inflection or the accelerating point is usually given around about the 1950s, kind of post-war reconstruction, the change in the regulation, the relaxation of the regulation of finance. There's about as many different stories as to what produced the Great Acceleration there are people telling stories about the Great Acceleration. But what we can be sure is that there was this kind of onset of exponential increase in certain socio-economic trends. Yes, population, yes, real GDP, and then that produced commensurate impacts. Maybe not exponential, certainly very increasing in terms of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, these kind of climate drivers. But then also, if you're thinking about other impacts on the biosphere. So certainly since, let's say, the 1970s, the global population has doubled. And at the same time, the average size of wild animal populations has halved. So we've swung a wrecking ball through the biosphere because of our increasing appetite for energy and materials. So we're thinking a lot about climate change because in some respects, climate change seems to be the thing that represents the most immediate risk. And I just want to show what this increasing energy consumption has been doing, because it's still the case that 80% of that is being driven by fossil fuels. So here we've got a visualization, it's called the pump handle for reasons that will become apparent, of concentrations of carbon dioxide as measured on this axis here. So it goes down to 330 parts per million, and it's going to go up to and above 415. These points here are points on the Earth's surface and latitude. So here's the South Pole, here's the equator, here's the North Pole. These little dots correspond to research stations. You can see them in this map over here. And this red dot is Mauna Loa. It's a research station on the top of an extinct volcano in Hawaii. And if I get the video started, you can see in the late 1970s, Mauna Loa was recording 336 parts per million of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere. Now, a number of things are going to happen as the years tick by. The first one is that more dots appear on this line because humans are becoming increasingly interested in the amount of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere. The other thing you can see is the years tick by. So here we're on 1986. We've got January, April, July, October. There's a clear annual signal. So CO2 is going up and down each year. And the reason it's going up and down is because if you think where the map is, imagine where the equator is here. So most of the Earth's land surface is to the north of the equator. So most of the terrestrial biosphere, most of the vegetation is to the north of the equator. So in the northern hemisphere summer, where the trees grow their leaves and the flowers bloom, they suck in carbon dioxide from the Earth's atmosphere. And in the autumn and the winter, when the trees drop their leaves and the vegetation dies back, they respire that carbon dioxide back out. So this movement up and down is literally the biosphere breathing in and breathing out. Now, all things being equal, the amount that it breathes in will be the same that it breathes out. But over on this axis here, you can see that it's not. There is a clear sinusoidal signal here, this kind of wibbly wobbly line. But certainly since the 1980s, it's been going up. There's a clearly increasing annual trend. Now, there have been direct measurements of carbon dioxide from the Earth's atmosphere since the late 1950s. That was produced by the US geoscientist Stephen Keeling. And for reasons that will become apparent when the video continues on, this increase in CO2 is called the Keeling curve. Because Keeling observed within a few years that, yes, there was this strong annual signal, it's going up and down, or interannual signal, but there are clearly increasing annual trends. And the reason there is an increasing annual trend, as we now all know very well, is because of that increasing energy consumption, which is largely met by the burning of fossil fuels. So this is the green Keeling data. We've got it from 1958 to 1979. And as you probably know, we can reconstruct atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide going back further. We can look at things like tree rings, fossilized leaves, but most importantly, ice core. So if you go to certain parts on the Earth's surface, there are kilometers thick ice sheets, at the bottom of which you can extract using a core. And in that ice, there will be tiny little bubbles of air, and you extract the air. And in that little tiny bubble of air, you will find a concentration of CO2 along with some other kind of proxies. And when we do that, we can reconstruct atmospheric CO2 and temperature and other bits and pieces, going back now tens of thousands and then even hundreds of thousands and soon beyond millions of years. If you're going back tens of thousands of years, then you're going to be in the ice ages, where you'll see very, very large changes from the top of an interglacial period all the way back down to a glacial maximum, where we might be seeing differences of about 185 parts per million at its lowest, up to about 278 parts per million, which was the pre-industrial amount, so the amount of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere before we started burning coal, oil and gas. So whilst there have been very large changes in CO2 over time in the past, it's important to acknowledge that these changes will often take many thousands of years to produce. What we have done over the last 200 to 300 years is essentially geologically instant. And certainly in terms of magnitude, the amount that we've increased it and the rate that we've increased it, you'd have to go back probably many millions of years to find an analogous event in the Earth's climate. Now, we've known for many years that as you increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere, you're going to increase the greenhouse effect, and you would expect to see temperature increase. And this is indeed what we do see. So this is a visualization of surface temperature changes. If it's dark blue, it's 2 degrees cooler. And if it's bright red, it's 2 degrees warmer than an average which is the temperature between 1950 and 1980. So when we start the video, which is between 1880 and 1884, most places are blue because there has been a warming trend. And as you watch the video unfold, watch the years tick by, the bluer regions are becoming lighter, they're becoming yellow, they're becoming orange, and they're becoming red. Now, this is a really nice video because it shows that whilst there is a phenomenon of global climate change, the impacts in terms of temperature and then precipitation and another kind of environmental change is not uniform. Most of the warming has been happening up in the higher latitudes, up in the Arctic. It's a process called Arctic amplification, where climate change or global warming is around 3, 4, maybe even more than 4 times faster than the global rate. Also, land surface temperatures have been increasing much, much faster than average sea surface temperatures, because the seas themselves act as a massive thermal sink. Now, at the moment, the International Climate Agreement says that we should limit well below 2 degrees Celsius. It used to be 2 degrees, but then the more that we understand from the science and the impacts, it was understood that 2 degrees was never going to be safe. And so it was 1.5. But let's just say it was 2 degrees, and we're heading anywhere between 3 degrees and maybe even 4 by the end of the century. What would be the difference between 2 degrees Celsius and 4 degrees Celsius? Civilization, essentially. You don't get 11 billion people alive at the end of this century if we've managed to increase average temperature of the Earth by 4 degrees Celsius. Large regions of the tropics would be literally uninhabitable, and whatever left is humanity would be living in the higher latitudes in Canada and Northern Europe. So this is what seems to be at stake right now. Fortunately, we have a savior, and that's science. So go, all you scientists, because you are going to save civilization. And this is the narrative. This is how it goes. This is the story that we're telling ourselves. Climate change is actually just one way in which we are impacting the Earth system. So climate change is shown in this planetary boundaries framework as being one of 9 dimensions, right? So what this does, it visualizes human impacts as radiating out from the center of a circle. If we're in this green zone, we think there's no immediate cause for alarm. If we're in the yellow, we're kind of entering this zone of uncertainty. And if we're in the red, we think we're beyond the zone of uncertainty. It's like a high risk area. So you can see that climate change actually isn't even in the red with regard to this formulation. We seem to be leaving the zone of uncertainty and approaching the kind of the high risk area, this boundary here, but there was presumably still enough time to turn the ship around. The greatest cause of a concern are things like biogeochemical flows, the amount of phosphorus and nitrogen that we dig up, put on the ground, and then it has devastating ecosystem impacts. And then also something they call biospheric integrity, essentially rates of species lost. We're probably entering one of the great mass extinction events in the history of life on Earth. So if life's been around for about 3.8 billion years, there have been a series of big extinction events, 5, maybe 6. The great one being the end Permian about 252 million years ago, where over 96% of species just disappeared in the oceans within maybe just a million years or so. We seem to be having an impact at that magnitude, or approaching that magnitude, such that we might be beginning to see the 7th or maybe even 6th mass extinction event in the history of life on Earth, right? So this is why, in a planetary perspective, a planetary boundaries perspective, where right now the greatest cause of concern could be just the sheer amount of species that we are losing as a consequence of human development. But the plan here is that science is going to have an important factor, because what science is going to do through planetary boundaries and other frameworks, it's going to detect where this safe limit is. And the reason we want to detect the safe limit is not because we care about the biosphere, not because we care about climate change or anything else to do with the Earth system, but we only worry about it until such time we push it into a state that it's going to be bad for us. The climate system will come and bite us. It'll bite us on the bum because it will change weather patterns. It will make it very difficult for us to grow food. Biosphere integrity is a concern because if ecosystem services stop, if the kind of things that ecosystem services do for us, then we might not have crops that gets pollinated. We might not have soils that get regenerated. So it's a very kind of anthropocentric perspective. And science can tell us where the boundaries are, and then science can tell us essentially how we can best steer our civilization. So there's this kind of flight deck. Science is providing some of the instrumentation, these kind of very complicated controls, and that the climate policy system, which is comprised of politicians and CEOs and very important and influential people, can grab the controls and steer humanity, steer our civilization away from the mountains and ensure that we enter a safe and just space into the future. There's one problem with this narrative. And the way that I would try and explain it is that if you were to make your way to the civilization flight deck, if you were to try to take control of our civilization, you'd realize there's nowhere for you to sit. There are no seats because the flight deck hasn't actually been made for us. It's a largely autonomous system that obviously we've been importantly involved in building, but it's not something we can necessarily control. This is a strange idea, and it's not my own idea, right? Where does this particular idea come from? Somebody like Peter Haff, I would say. So Peter Haff, I don't think he coined the word, but he certainly popularized it, or the term. And he calls our civilization, think about that 30 trillion metric tons. Think of all that energy that humans consume, the stuff, almost like the metabolism, the physical body of our civilization. He calls it the technosphere. And he calls it the humans, their artifacts, and links between them. So it's almost trying to take a planetary perspective of our civilization. Now, when we do that, we can ask some really strange sounding questions. We can ask things like the technosphere agency. So previously I was talking about agency in, let's say, nuclear weapon systems, or maybe even agency now in our civilization. But we're at the center of the story. We tell a narrative and we're the leading characters. But if there's such a thing as the technosphere, then you can begin to consider whether or not it has a sense of agency, and then what does it want, right? Now, obviously, we can't really ask it because even if the technosphere does speak a language, it's not one that we can currently understand. But we can certainly look at its history and its development and its previous path, and maybe simply do regressions into what it's going to do into the future. And when you do that, growth seems to be an important part of it. It grows by dissipating energy gradients. In the lithosphere, there are trillions of joules of energy just waiting to be exploited in the forms of coal, oil, and gas. And in some respects, the Earth system was kind of just waiting for some species to develop the technology in order to extract that, right? And there's lots of different riffs we can go on. But the point I'm trying to get to today, or emphasize, is that we might be part of the technosphere. We built it, but we don't necessarily control it. Now, I think this makes sense if you can take a more planetary scale approach. So we've all heard about the biosphere, and some of us have heard about the geosphere. The geosphere would be the description of the Earth system in the absence of life. So what things, what concepts, maybe even what kind of science would you need to understand how the Earth system works? Well, for a planetary system such as Mars or Venus or Mercury, a geospheric kind of concept works. It doesn't work on the Earth. You know, Earth has got life, it's got abundant life, and that life is fundamentally destabilized. It's produced atmospheres very far from equilibrium. It's done lots of weird things even before civilization. So you need to include the impacts that life has on the planetary system. Hence, you need a concept of a biosphere. And then you've got the noosphere. Now, pretty much no one has ever heard of the noosphere, apart from, you know, esoteric scholars such as probably Simon. But the noosphere is the sphere of human thought. So if you try to understand how does the planet work in the absence of life, you can use a geospheric concept. Once you have life, you need a kind of a biosphere. But once you've got intelligent species that might have a civilization, that might have technology, in order to understand what's going on that planet, you might also need the noosphere, the sphere of human thought. And Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and Vernadsky are the two people most closely associated with the noosphere. And I think they can, well, it's quite wacky, some aspects of noosphere, especially Pierre's spiritual interpretations, which you might find challenging or difficult. But really, there's something important here because they're trying to get almost like an explanatory acid of why is the Earth system the way it is right now. If you imagine an alien were coming down to look at Earth and looking at this kind of mass destabilization of the atmosphere and mass extinction events and tremendous amounts of energy and material being consumed by one particular species, it only really makes sense if you have a noosphere. And when you put those things together, I think then you can have a richer description of the Earth system, such that the technosphere can serve as a useful and explanatory framework. Now, in some respects, this is kind of just old beer. It's just the latest major transition in evolution, where you can see there's been maybe increasing complexity, increasing information through the process of evolutionary mechanisms. The problem I have with this kind of formulation of the major transitions is that there's never, typically, there is never really any consideration of the Earth system, the planetary system within which that system has evolved. You know, the Earth system is some kind of substrate over which all this happens. But of course, the Earth system is intimately involved in life. I mean, life is literally repurposed matter that previously came from abiotic elements of the Earth. And when we're thinking about the technosphere, the civilizational scale system that we've produced, it's not some little membrane that lies on top of the Earth. It's deeply motivated and animated by system processes. It truly is a planetary scale phenomena. Now, and that's not to underplay the involvement of information and informational networks. There are often computational narratives or computational stories or information processing stories that we tell ourselves about evolutionary processes and maybe even our current civilization. And they're important, but they can lull us into a false sense of agency where we can, you know, if you take a kind of transhumanist perspective, we will soon be able to divorce ourselves from our physical bodies and become just pure information, and our agency would be, you know, just infinite. And of course, that's silly. Where we are right now is a system which is incredibly constraining because in part of its history. So this is the A37, an otherwise unremarkable road. The main reason I think I showed a picture of the A37, I think it's one of the oldest roads. I think this might actually date back to a Roman road. And And the point here is that, knowingly or not, we are importantly constrained by how we act. The things that have happened in the past, the development of our civilization in the past, strongly constrains on what we can do right now. So, for example, if you want to get from point A to point B, you just don't go there directly. You have to follow roads, which in some instances are much, much older than the nation, right? They could be hundreds or thousands of years old. There's another way of thinking about how we are constrained. I think this should be a station in Tokyo, right? Now you think about what a city is. It inhales millions of people in the mornings, and it exhales them at the end of the day. And when you're taking this kind of planetary scale technosphere perspective, you can almost look at individual human beings as being like cells within this kind of planetary scale phenomena. We're doing work, we're moving energy around, we're moving information around. And obviously we can explain all those things with regards to the individual agencies of all these different people. Everyone's got their own life story. Everyone's got the stories about why they're moving through that station concourse on that particular day. But if you zoom out and maybe even take some kind of planetary scale perspectives, maybe over longer timescale perspectives, you can come up with some interesting considerations. Say, for example, the plough. The plough was an important piece of technology that allowed the significant increase in the total numbers of people, because by ploughing and the agrarian revolution around 13,000 years ago, you could significantly increase the amount of food you could generate from a particular unit area of land. And then you've got the rapid migration from hunter-gatherer societies into sedentary societies and into the precursors of more complex societies and then civilization as we know it. But really that served as a ratchet. Once people began to farm, it became very, very difficult for them to go back to previous modes of existence. Certainly now, the vast majority of humanity can't even farm. We're just reliant on farmers. And certainly we're nowhere able to satisfy our requirements if we went to previous hunter-gatherer societies. So there are these kind of steps or ratchets. So this gets me towards the end of the talk, hopefully. I might have to skip out some bit. I said I'd be too long, Alice. Right. Where it gets to considerations of the role of technology and specific technologies in this story. Now, at the moment, the way we're going, we seem to be heading towards potentially bad outcomes with regards to the climate. And some people are concerned about the role of technology in that. Now, Hollywood features such as this from, I think this is from the original Terminator film, 1984 or something, was the idea of killer robots and, you know, humanity being at risk from being taken over by the technology that humans build. But really the risks are much, much more mundane, but still as serious. Here's a title from Humans, which was a nice little TV show. I think I made it into season 2 or something. 3 seasons, but this tells the story of kind of replicant type humans who are living in a society, and this type of robot, this type of technology is actually replacing human labor. And that seems to be one of the great concerns at the moment. Increased automation. Soon there will be fully autonomous road vehicles such that truck drivers, lorry drivers won't exist anymore. There's increasing automation in other sectors of society. This kind of inexorable sense of technology replacing what humans are going to do in terms of their productive labor. And so it's not so much that humans are going to disappear because robots are going to annihilate them, but there's kind of an existential issue at the moment with regards to, well, what is the point of maybe even certain types of education? How can people continue to play a productive role in societies given increasing automation, given the increasing deployment of technology? So what's the point of school? What's the point of humans? Now, Technosphere's perspective actually allows us to answer that question in some interesting ways. There have been formulations of humans being some kind of servant to technology. So this is a still from the Matrix, which imagines humans as some kind of battery that the Matrix is using to power itself. Well, I think it's around the other way around, right? It's not that humans are producing energy, it's that humans are solving a really important problem for the technosphere. So soon it's going to be Black Friday. This shows some footage from, this is in the UK, where we kind of have imported the mania for this particular kind of retail event. And in this perspective, what humans do is essentially we consume. Bonus points for anyone who knows what film this is alluding to. Maybe we'll get that into the Q&A. So what humans are doing in regards to the technosphere is that we are serving as points of consumption. We shouldn't be concerned about humans being replaced by robots in forms of the mechanisms of production, but we should be worried if robots or other forms of autonomous technology ever took our place as consumers, because it's the increasing consumption which is driving the growth of the technosphere. I mean, if you think about it, the reason we have increasing energy consumption and increasing material consumption is because we're increasing the number of goods and services which ultimately are consumed by human beings. So in that respect, we're kind of like a foie gras, which is being force-fed products, goods and services. Now, the reason that is because through the consumption of goods, products and services, we can grow the technosphere. We can increase the energetic and material throughput of the technosphere. What this means is that humans are useful idiots, which doesn't seem to be a very nice way or very respectful way of thinking about what humanity is. Certainly, people don't like to be told that Homo sapiens sapiens, wise man, are just useful idiots for a planetary scale kind of civilization. We want to think, and we do think, that individual humans have value. But again, it's that collective sense, what humans are doing collectively, what the species is doing collectively in the context of the technosphere. So in that respect, maybe humans aren't idiots, maybe they're like slime molds. So individually, slime molds are not very interesting, but as you all know, because you're at Sussex, and we all love slime molds at Sussex and emergent properties, is that these individual kind of organisms can collectively self-organize such that they can move around and they have all the properties of an individual complex differentiated organism. But here I want to talk about the fact that what humans might be doing are producing the fruiting bodies of the technosphere. So for those of you who don't know, slime molds, individual kind of bacteria like amoeba type organisms, they collectively organize, can move around, and then they differentiate themselves such that a number of the individual organisms produce this kind of a stem, and then there are kind of a fruiting body that gets produced, and that then kind of bursts, and the next generation of organisms can then be dispersed across a wider area. So the technosphere in this respect is the production of a particular species, Homo sapiens, which is increasing the size of the technosphere, and the fruiting body, well, that would be something like our colonization of space. So this is a kind of panspermian idea, really. But of course, as exciting and as wonderful as living on Mars is, if it comes at trashing the planet, then many people would consider that not a very good trade. And that's where we seem to be going at the moment. This notion of the technosphere just seems that it will happily liquidate the entire biosphere in order to maintain growth. But this must be self-limiting. There is this notion at the moment that as bad as climate change gets, as bad as the biodiversity crisis becomes, as polluted as the oceans get, at some point it becomes self-limiting because you're going to choke off the process of industrialization whereby that happens. And I want to argue that's not necessarily the case. I will briefly return to Dr. Strangelove, who comes up with a fiendish plan in order to avoid total annihilation. When it looks as if the whole world is going to be destroyed, Dr. Strangelove realizes that there are a number of disused mine shafts in the United States, and they have sufficient capacity to hold a population of around 10 to 20,000 people. So if you hand-picked, in some sense, 20,000 people from the United States, that would include, for example, the president and Dr. Strangelove and the rest of the generals, you could, in maybe about 1,000 years' time, come back out onto the surface and then repopulate the Earth once the radiation has reduced to non-lethal levels. And this produces one of my favorite quotes from the entire film, from a general who realizes that if Dr. Strangelove has thought about taking refuge in mine shafts, then you can be sure that the Russians have thought about taking refuge in mine shafts, and that if after 1,000 years, when both populations emerge, the Russians have been colonizing more mine shafts, then they will be able to take over the United States because there'll be more Russians to start off with. Hence, he says, Mr. President, we must not allow a mine shaft gap. It's in the United States' interest to try and develop as many mine shafts as quickly as possible, such that in 1,000 years, when we return to the surface, we won't be just beaten by the commies again. It's ridiculous, right? Now, we know that would never work anyway, because you can't maintain a civilization for 1,000 years or so. And in some respects, we have avoided one moment of annihilation. So there are numerous instances of this. This is a hardened nuclear bunker, which is now disused, because many of the bunkers we assume are not going to be needed because we avoided that particular route of self-annihilation. Yes, there are still a large number of strategic nuclear weapons. Yes, they're still pointed all over the world, but hopefully we are far, far away from seeing a full-scale nuclear exchange. But there's something interesting going on, because here's a reconditioned nuclear bunker. And this is for the purpose of surviving a potential civilization ending scale event, but in a certain amount of style. So these photographs are coming from Survival Condo. It's an abandoned Atlas missile silo actually, but inside it doesn't hold a nuclear weapon. It holds this. It holds a swimming pool and a luxury condominium. There are plans and processes and schemes being produced, such as Vivos Point. So Vivos Point is a point in the United States, which in this marketing material shows is far away from urban centres, people, and also estimated blast radius from particularly nuclear weapons. It's about 3/4 of the size of Manhattan, and within it, it consists entirely of subterranean bunkers. Basically, it's reconditioned nuclear bunkers such that it is private, defensible, and totally off-grid. So there are serious plans for some people to weather not just a nuclear apocalypse, but things like the breakdown in the biosphere, the combination of the climate and ecological crisis. Certainly, when you're looking at where the billionaire class are spending their money, they're spending their money increasingly in New Zealand. They're buying up large tracts of land in other places in continental North America and other regions, bottom of mountains, things like this, and actually building entire communities that will be able to withstand an event. The event is never really specified, but you can imagine it would encompass a whole range of potential destabilizing impacts. The point here is that I would argue that the technosphere itself may be much more reliant than most human societies. So that civilization scale, civilization ending event that I alluded to earlier with 4 degrees Celsius, there would still be a significant number of people. The global population may be about 3 billion. So that means maybe 5-6 billion people would have perished, but there would still be relatively affluent people still consuming energy, still consuming materials. And the wider story, what the technosphere has done, would do then, and has certainly been doing up till now, is that the technosphere has been growing by evading constraints. Just like all kind of biological organisms, it reaches a carrying capacity, and then it will, through various innovations, through adaptations, avoid those constraints. Of course, it's been human beings which have been instrumental in allowing it to avoid those constraints, but it's been allowing it to grow. So to finish, when you're taking something like a planetary boundaries perspective, when you're taking an anthropocentric perspective, the only reason we care about the Earth system is because we want it to do the things that we want it to do. You set yourself up for a classic situation, or the classic problem of the trolley problem. If the only value you've got for the biosphere is that it provides goods and services of humanity, then you can easily see situations in which almost there's an infinite amount of the biosphere that you would sacrifice in order to satisfy humanity's needs. We currently don't really have, at least operating in the international climate policy system, any mechanism whereby the notions of the intrinsic value of the biosphere could ever enter into the negotiations. We look at the Earth system in purely instrumental terms. We will denude the Earth's biosphere. We will remove all of its tropical rainforests as long as we can continue to satisfy humanity's needs. The moment that humanity's needs seem to be threatened is the moment we reflect on our impacts on the Earth system, but that's only because we value the human-centric. It's a very anthropocentric. What kind of value system would one need in order to consider the biosphere as having some innate rights, or maybe even legal obligations and rights? So to conclude, some thoughts. How are we going to process or make our way through this potential bottleneck that the technosphere is throwing up for us? Because I'm assuming we all want to avoid the Republican conclusion, right? So I think the first thing is that we need to acknowledge that the technosphere is not for us. Humans over many, many generations have built a system, but that system doesn't necessarily serve our best interests. You know, the fact that many generations have built this kind of prison doesn't necessarily mean that we are free. You know? And in order for us to understand that we are in a prison, we first need to be able to see the bars. But it's been very, very hard for us to do that because we've always assumed that human technology and civilization is necessary for us. The next thing we need to think about very carefully what growth is for and what ends does it serve. There's a creation myth around capitalism and globalization, which is further energy and material consumption is necessarily for us. It's about satisfying humans' needs. Well, that's simply not true. We can refute that. But then more generally, we need to ask ourselves, what is economic growth? What is energy and material consumption growth for? The third one is we need to go beyond consumption and therefore what constitutes a good life. And the last one is, I think we could do an awful lot if we began to replace capitalism's origin story. It's the creation myth around capitalism, that capitalism has been the engine of growth for the betterment of humanity. Certainly, it's transformed the lives of billions of people, and I don't mean to argue that's been a kind of a byproduct, but the impacts that it is having on the Earth system and ultimately on human societies and Homo sapiens, it's not a bug, it's a feature. And I think a deeper appreciation of how capitalism works within the technosphere might actually help us. I've finished. Thank you.